The reign of Malice and Risle is now over, and a brand new era of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is about to begin. With the release of this brand new Yu-Gi-Oh! Set, Justice Hunters, a new metagame has formed with several new top decks that outclass the previous best decks of Risle and Malice. So with a bunch of new options to choose from, what are the best decks of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Format? And before we get into this tier list, if you guys enjoy this type of content, please make sure to let me know in the comments down below, as well as please like and subscribe. We are on our way to 100,000 subscribers, and I'd like to do so before the end of the year, so support would be much appreciated. And with that said, let's move on to the actual tier list. So I guess before putting things into a specific tier, I want to paint the picture of the format, because as I've said many times, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a sort of ecosystem, right? And of course, when you play against your opponent, everything interacts together. And it's the same with all the decks, and how each cards and tech cards can shape the metagame. There are the best decks, and also the decks that are driving forces or dominant forces in shaping the rest of the ecosystem. What are the driving forces then in the current metagame? Well, I think it's no surprise that all three decks from Justice Hunters are meta contenders: Dracotail, K9, and Yummy. Now, K9 itself is not a complete deck. It is an engine, and it can be played in multiple forms. There's the small engine of 3 Azuna and 1 Lupus, which almost any deck can incorporate. But for the sake of talking about K9 in this video, or a K9 deck, the K9 decks will incorporate a larger package, oftentimes including the Case of K9, the Rank Up spell, as well as Jokels and potentially Lantern. So, for example, when I say a K9 deck, the two main ones that I'm going to be referencing for this video are going to be K9 Vanquish Soul, which is the most common, I'd say, as well as K9 Crystron, a deck that was popular in Japan until the Vanquish Soul cards came out. And while you may be coming for me to guidance on which of these three decks to pick up, which of these is the strongest, I don't think it's super straightforward. And I'll give a little bit of spoiler of the actual tier list itself. The three best decks and dominant forces are going to be Dracotail, Yummy, and K9 Vanquish Soul, which doesn't really eliminate which one is the best or which one you should buy. And I will go into a deeper explanation to the intricacies and interactions between these decks and why there's three tier 1 best decks right now. But for now, it's important to understand that these three themes, all from Justice Hunters, are the ones that shape the rest of the format. So with that in mind, what changes with Justice Hunters? What specific interactions are important to note that may invalidate older themes or make older themes a little more approachable? So there's going to be one big difference. Well, there's multiple, but one really big difference, like absolutely format warping difference. And that is K9 Izuna and K9 Lupus. Now, I talked about the K9 engine in a previous video a couple weeks back. And if you haven't watched that video, I recommend you do. But the underlying theme of that video is that this package of 3 Azuna and 1 Lupus, or even just the grander K9 deck in general, means that hand traps become worse, but also if you are playing against a deck that uses graveyard or hand effects, you can now put up removal hand traps, making Nash Knight on your opponent's first turn, which against a lot of decks can be devastating. Or if you don't want removal, you can make Ripper, and Ripper is still going to be a negate for effects in the hand to grave, which against a lot of decks can be very powerful. And on top of that, it's untargetable thanks to Lupus, which can lead to some pretty big pushes. So as we're transitioning over from the EU and NA WCQ formats, and we're looking at what has changed, and when we're ranking the decks, we'll see a reflection of this as the decks that don't do well into this mechanic and this non-engine, which can really be played in any deck, not just K9 decks, will invalidate or make worse a lot of decks that use graveyard effects. For example, Orchist, a deck that I now put in the poor section, is something that I wouldn't really feel happy bringing to a large tournament. Now, obviously, Orchist still has its merits as far as effects go. The individual card quality is still relatively strong, but the problem is K9 Azuna is a fantastic hand trap against Orchist. With many graveyard effects, it makes playing through the hand traps harder than it was before, and Ripper is no different, right? Playing through a rank 5 K9 Ripper is going to be challenging, especially because the Ripper then generates more follow-up on the next turn. This isn't exclusive to Orchist, though. Other decks which wouldn't have coped as well into removal and relied on graveyard hand effects before do get noticeably worse. For example, Mitsurugi card. While not extremely weak to removal, the fact that cards like Valen and Ripper and Nash Knight can be summoned on your turn 1 and sometimes untargetable means that if you, at the end of your combo, your opponent has an Azuna and you have no hard negate or removal piece to stop it, you could just lose your Ame or lose something else super important. It greatly weakens your field, and it's a pretty big difference. Live Twin Fiendsmith is another example. This deck managed to make top cut at the NAWCQ, a deck I don't think I included in my last tier list. But I think while it was already not the best choice for that event, but obviously did decent enough and had some things going for it, it only gets further worse as your plays can be disrupted so much easier with K9 Azuna in the metagame. And other decks that I already felt weren't well positioned, like Mermails, also continue to just get worse, as Ripper is a crazy card. One thing worth noting is Mermail can sometimes play better when your opponent controls a card, because you get to use both Poseidon XYZ and the Poseidon level 7 monster. Their effects do send and then trigger Dragoons or Squad can be valuable. However, with Lupus spreading and targeting, you cannot use the level 7 Poseidon. If you can get to a rank 7, that effect does not target and you can get extra value, but that requires a lot more to be already going your way. And with the topic of Mermail, there's another interesting point. Mermail thrives when it goes first because it plays excellently into negation. However, when it comes to removal, it's not terrible, but it's not very good either. And one of the biggest problems with Mermail into removal is the fact that, although it seems an endless number of pushes, it's actually rather limited. And while I talked about how Izuna provides removal, there are other ways that removal can be generated. First, Vanquish Soul, Holly Sue. Between Holly Sue and Izuna, Vanquish Soul now has a somewhat reliable way of dealing with turn 1 fields via removal. So now when your opponent summons a Neptibus, there's a reasonable chance the Neptibus just gets stolen. You don't get to hand trap in other ways, because Veiling it and Permanent Irration always felt terrible, as the graveyard effect of whatever you sent would still trigger. Now you deny that altogether. And again, Holly Sue isn't alone. The other newer card is from Justice Hunters, and of course I'm talking about Dracotail Phimina, which will let you fusion summon for any spellcaster or dragon. Now, there are some niche things you can summon, like Mysterion, the Crown Dragon, Secretarian Dragon, and Winda, which provide different uses, but the main card that's going to be a disruptor in the metagame is Arthalion, the Dracotail fusion monster, which upon summoning will let you bounce a number of cards from the field to the hand, or graveyards, up to the number of fusion materials used in the hand. So it's going to be at least 2. And they can recycle their own hand traps this way, but importantly, again, this is removal, which immediately means decks that really just struggle against removal may just falter altogether. And this factor is a large reason why a lot of decks are falling from their top spots in the metagame. For example, Malice, a deck which I'll get to its placing momentarily, but no longer stands at the precipice of the format like it used to. Don't get me wrong, the deck is still good, and we'll discuss it a little bit more shortly, but it's not the same level of dominance that it held merely a month ago. And thusly, decks that have either an abundance of extenders or care maybe not that much about removal will tend to rise a little bit above where maybe they were a little bit ago. And because there's so much removal that's not even in play on the field, it makes it hard for board breaker decks to kind of keep alive. Because if you built your entire deck to clear a field to then say normal summon Tenpai Chandra, there's a very real chance your opponent just goes, activate Holly Sue, and you go, oh no. So for that reason, decks like Gem Knight and Chandra Tenpai feel like they're poor choices. And there's too much going on in both the field and the hand for you to really combat those sort of play styles. And that's not to understate either that one thing the K9 package does allow with a lot of other level 5s, if you play them, is Paradise Smasher, a very integral part of building your deck in this format, as it could just lock you out of the game if you're playing against a level 5 centric deck, or just there's enough K9 cards. Yummy provides the least significant amount of shifts in the format. Yummy plays a lot more like a, I wouldn't say traditional combo deck, but more like a deck we've seen in the last few years, with some solid extenders, crazy powerful extra deck monsters, and then some broken starter cards like Engage and Obedience Schooled. It can turn one-card combos into pretty powerful plays that set up multiple disruptions. It's nothing really new. The biggest, or the few small changes that exist within Yummy as they affect the metagame is Yummy particularly thrives when it's playing in response to the opponent's card effects. Your Yummy synchros, when your opponent does something, it can chain to revive. Arclight, same thing, chain to negate. So when you're able to generate strong bodies without activating effects, then you can actually maneuver pretty comfortably around them. So Castor Fenrir and Dynaressel Pankratops have both seen some rise in play as they're decent into Yummy. They do serve other purposes too, but it's important to note that those are actually playable here. And then lastly, there's one other sort of big change that comes with these three driving forces. And first of which is Droll is no longer the behemoth it used to be. Droll is not unplayable versus Vanquish Soul, but it's not great either. When you do that, it does open up a lot of extra plays with the K9 cards on their turn one, while not completely annihilating what Vanquish Soul or the other K9 cards can do. It effectively does nothing versus Dracotail, and versus Yummy, it also does exceedingly little. For the Link 1 doesn't even search, it just for some reason places it from deck onto the field. Charmies as well have arguably gotten worse, with Cerulean in fact getting better as it thrives well into the Vanquish Soul deck and is playable versus Yummy. But Foolos has gotten worse. It is not an unplayable card, and it's likely a card we will still see in mains or side decks, but it can be navigated around with some precision by Vanquish Soul. Dracotail is usually trading for a one card, and then your opponent makes a slightly worse field to not give any more. And then Yummy can pivot around. Yummy is a little bit more weird because it's more traditional of a combo deck, but it has enough plays that it's not a complete end, and you can give your opponent a couple draws to still make a pretty strong field that, depending on what you're up against, will still hold true. So it's important to note that those hand traps are not to the same pedigree that they were held before. So now that we've talked about these big changes, let's talk about where things may fall on the tier list as a result. Sky Striker is one that I think still falters to make a meaningful difference in the metagame. Sky Striker, to me now, feels like a Tenpai deck, where it uses its quick play spells to clear the field, and then Ray and Linkage type cards do actually present like 8,000 damage, because you cycle Linkage in the battle phase and do a crap ton. And it's not traditional grind game Striker style. I mean, to some degree you can play that grind game, but most decks will push through it. Widowmaker is not as crazy of a card as it used to be, especially against Vanquish Soul, which can dodge things so easily. And it's no different for Yummy, which can tag out, or with the Dracotails, which can quick fuse and use mostly graveyard effects anyways. In my mind, Striker is just still a poor choice for the format. And lastly, the one kind of last deck I wanted to mention in the poor section is Branded, a deck that could be seen as playable and could even be splashed with Dracotail, but I'm not a huge fan of. It plays rather poorly in my mind into the K9 cards. They trigger them, which is the biggest concern. It's not necessarily the worst into a K9 Ripper or into a Nash Knight, but you're still giving your opponent free activations while not doing much else. And Branded hasn't gotten new supports to bolster its end field in quite some time. And we're approaching enough power creep to where now, reasonably, if you're ending on half fields through interruption as Branded, maybe it's a Mirror Jade and an Albaz Suck-Up, you actually can still lose. It's not super sets that you'll just run away with the game. One thing I've noticed to be randomly annoying if you're playing against K9 is that they always have the option of going Lupus rank up into Typhon, which for some decks with 3000 attack can matter a great deal. And if you're playing the Branded deck, you're not careful, this can lock you entirely out of the game, because remember, they'll do this during your turn. So now when it goes back to their turn, Typhon's not locking them out of summoning. They have an untargetable Typhon in the field that denies Mirror Jade any sort of ability. If you want to make it untargeting, they can detach and bounce, but the interruption will still be there. And that does matter a great deal in some matchups, and Branded is one that does matter. Still, power creep does seem to chip away further and further this deck, as every other deck seems better, and Branded has not gotten anything. In fact, only getting worse, with Branded Fusion being limited within the last year. To me, that encompasses the majority of the poor decks. Anything I don't mention from the rest of this tier list, I think, is a little bit better. Even if not a ton, these are decks that I would avoid bringing to any major tournaments, But if these are decks you enjoy, you can make them work, just you will be playing at a disadvantage. Now, before moving on to the lackluster section, or decks that are just decent, and my sleeper tier 1 picks, I'd like to mention the intricacies of the tier 1 decks, the dominant forces. Our Vanquish Soul K9 deck, we have Draco Tail, and we have Yummy. So how come we have 3 best decks? This happens from time to time. We enter something called a triangle format. And that's where we have 3 very strong decks that almost have good matchups into each other. And they may not be guaranteed wins, but they are favored nonetheless. Vanquish Soul K9 is probably the best all around as a deck, but it's not without weaknesses. For example, in some cases, you can rely on your opponents to activate hand effects for you to really pop off to the maximum. And if you don't, while your board is still good, it can be broken by the right type of deck and extenders. And that deck is Yummy, a deck which is oftentimes being built right now to play no hand traps. That way it can be consistent, build the breakers to beat the funerals that Vanquish Soul can do, and the only hand traps you will play are Impermanence and Songs of the Dominators to deny a Paradise Smasher, which without Izuna and Lewis being live is incredibly costly to try and set up, if even possible at all in some hands. So what ends up happening is Yummy ends up having a favorable matchup into Vanquish Soul. That being said, Yummy is still a more traditional style combo deck, and removal is impactful against them. So Phimina from Draco Tail is really, really big, as well as Draco Tail plays really from the hand and graveyard more than the field. And while Vanquish Soul does to some extent, it's not as much as Draco Tail. And Draco Tail can just kind of push through and churn through Yummy's field relatively easily, and going into grind games that are very strong. Furthermore, the board breakers work rather poorly against Draco Tail because, again, this disruption is just not all on field, and even the ones that aren't in monster form, right? You have the Draco Tail trap cards, which can thrive against Obedience School, a powerful card that the deny is a huge deal, or bouncing just the Link monster before they have another guy on field with the other trap. Draco Tail can also play more hand traps than Vanquish Soul, so it plays more like a traditional mid-range deck, as well as it can recycle set hand traps with Off the Lion. With all that in mind, it ends up having a much more favorable matchup into Yummy, and you can more appropriately build your deck with non-engine because you have more spaces for it to combat it. There is one problem with Draco Tail, and it's non-engine, and that is your deck needs to have monsters. There are a lot of hands where you just want to fuse away your non-engine cards for Arthur Lion, and it's not a problem because you can add it back. But when your hand is full of spell cards, you deny yourself the ability to get going. And what this means is if the format ever shifts to a point where spell and trap non-engine is incredibly important, Draco Tail will suffer. And this is why something like Kashtira Fenrir can be good in Draco Tail. It provides you more fusion material for your Draco Tail deck, while still keeping the Fenrir on field, as well as it's just decent into several matchups. Now, one other big thing that Fenrir can provide is it solves another weakness of the deck. Draco Tail does have a sort of kryptonite, and that is Retaliating Seed. It's not without flaw. Retaliating Seed is not an auto win, but Retaliating Seed can be used on any of the fusion spells, and then you have essentially a Macrocosmos in play, which for Draco Tails is pretty bad. It's really hard to beat. You want to play around it by fusing with your non-spells first, or setting up ways of preventing it, or just Fenrir is good because when Retaliating Seed comes down, the cards you use immediately for your spells may get banished, but you can Fenrir the Retaliating Seed. At least it's not sticking there for the rest of the turn, which is important. It's the fact Retaliating Seed banishes the current cards and then poses the floodgate that makes it rather difficult to deal with. But then where Draco Tail is favored into Yummy, it feels like it's not that good into K9. Vanquish Soul K9 can be beaten with removal, but you need extreme amounts of it. You also can't just have some negation, you need extreme amounts of it. Where Yummy can put up an insurmountable defense, it feels like, the Draco Tail is more moderate. And it's enough to beat most decks without a crazy number of extenders, but the Vanquish Soul deck, which is very high engine count, can a fair number of the time just raw engine push through Draco Tail. As well as the K9 cards do thrive against the Draco Tail deck. And unless you're careful, Draco Tail can struggle when Ripper hits the field and is untargetable on the first turn, because that Ripper will now act as follow-up for the next turn, as well as negate a Draco Tail card or like Phimina this turn. Now, this applies to any deck playing the K9 cards, but it's even more prominent in the Vanquish Soul deck. Vanquish Soul decks otherwise also just plays decently into stuff. The bounce off of your Arthur Lion doesn't matter. The lack of Link monsters means that the Draco Tail trap that bounces doesn't matter because you can put things in defense mode. The matchup is not unlosable, but like none of these matchups are, they are still definitely unfavored. Playing Draco Soul into Vanquish Soul is a bit of an uphill battle, and truthfully, a lot of your non-engines should be suited to deal with this deck, because otherwise it's going to be hard. And thusly, we end up with this triangle with 3 different powerful decks with different advantages and disadvantages that make them in some way or form better than one of the other decks and then worse than the other. And it's cool, but it can also mean you have an additional level of variance in your tournaments. Now, if you go to a YCS and you say play Draco Tails, you could have an easier tournament if you play all Yummies, but if you play all Vanquish Souls, it's going to be hard. And it's not the only level of luck that's involved, but matchup variance is something people may not address often enough, and it does matter, especially in more diverse formats. And that's not always a bad thing, but it can be frustrating, so keep the eye out for that when you want to complain about why you lost or did bad in one tournament. I talked about how Yummy kind of exists as a deck because it doesn't use hand or graveyard effects. There are other decks that can do a similar sort of thing, and they don't function at all like Yummy, but they can do decently okay as a result. The deck that comes to mind for me is Regenesis Kashtira. We already talked about how the Kashtira cards, do that, but the Regenesis cards are similar. They don't really have hand or graveyard effects, and you can build them with cards like Birds and Songs of Dominators and Imperm, just like you do Yummy. As well as these big beat sticks that don't activate, fare decently into Yummy. And overall, this gives you a decent matchup into several decks. You can play well into Yummy, you're not miserable into the Canine deck, your deck grinds decently versus the other two, and to me, as a result, Regenesis moves up from a deck I'd consider poor to a lackluster deck. Now, where it still holds back is just, I think the card quality there isn't quite right. Good as removal is, like Regenesis Birth and Fenrir, those have ironically gotten worse because the better decks are now more prepared for them, as they have to prepare against Arthur Lion and Holisu. And overall, its card quality, other decks have gotten stronger, your card quality has stayed stable. With that in mind, I think this deck is a little better than it was before though, and it's a cool deck to consider if you want to play something different and stick with that mid-range sort of control approach. If you want to take a different approach but also not play hand traps, I think Lunaite might be okay. Now this one is a bit weird. If people stop playing as many hand traps because they either don't have space like with Vanquish Soul, or they don't want to turn the Canine cards like for Yummy, then they may not have well-equipped ways of stopping Lunaite combos. A deck which I'd say, if uninterrupted, is probably the strongest deck right now, with multiple towers type monsters. The Baguska is still strong right now in this format. The fact that people are playing less stuff for this, less draws, might give this deck a reason to pop up a little bit. Right now I have this as just a lackluster deck because obviously removal can hurt, and the Canine cards can be used against you going first. You have to instead rely on extension to beat it. It is still, a problem. As well as going second with this deck, it's debatable if you can really make something work versus some of the stronger decks like Yummy and Vanquish Souls. I think versus a more control type deck like Draco Tails, you can make something work, but versus the other two decks, it might be kind of hard because they have a little too much defensively for you to cope with. I also think this deck hasn't been fully mastered or explored. I know some people have put more effort into it. I'm curious to see if they're able to come up with anything else, but I think Lunaite for me is something that I'm keeping on my radar for now, as it hasn't completely fallen off into oblivion as many decks do when a new format arises. Now, there is one other approach to this. The other way to approach dealing with the Canine conundrum and the hand trap thing is to play an abundance of hand traps. And this is something I'm approaching, and it's taking the Snake Eye way. While hand trapping Vanquish Soul feels bad because they then Dice Smasher you, if you have the first hand trap to disrupt them, the second hand trap to bait the Ripper, the third hand trap will stick. And that's where it matters. So this means is you're looking for either double or triple hand trap combinations to work. So you need to stick a surplus of hand traps. This is an approach I'm currently trying in Draco Tail, for example, because the deck can afford to fit that. And then once your opponent has used their Ripper, you get to use cards like Nib or Femina or Izuna even to kind of get across the finish line versus Canine. And then it means you still have a large number of hand traps for the more traditional combo deck like Yummy. I think the other strategy is to go the complete opposite spectrum and play a ton of hand traps, and one deck that can do that is Fiendsmith, or Fiendsmith Control, a more simple hand trap deck. And I think trying to put too many engines in this won't work like Live Twin, because those decks have choke points for removal, You need to instead just embrace the grind game factor and know that your end board is not going to be anything to die for. I think one of the plus sides of this is you can play this with just Canine cards, Canine Fiendsmith. That brings me to the decent section. Decks that I think can definitely top YCS. There will be some and they're solid, but have been dethroned. They have new weaknesses, whether it be power creep, whether it be new weaknesses to removals, not having the right non-engine lineup. One deck which I think is a sleepier tier 1 pick, a deck which falls only a little short of the top 3 and is still very easily a deck that can contend for a YCS title. All 5 of these decks, or I guess 4 of these decks, have taken top cuts from the WCQ, and one of those, I'll say it right now, Canine Crystron. So I had to talk about that already briefly. Now, if you're wondering what Canine Crystron is, this was a deck that sought to utilize the Canine cards because Canine cards truthfully don't have enough, like literally just not enough of them, to build an independent deck. So you need to find supplementary level 5 engines to make it work. And Vanquish Soul is the one that took off, and I do think it's better. The other version, and the original version that OCG played, was Crystron, because Sulfafnir and Sulfador are 5s. This deck is a solid mid-range deck because you get to set up several different negations that are pretty safe into hand traps, and most removal won't do much against you either, nor will negation. However, your end field won't be anything spectacular. For example, an uninterrupted end field of Crystron typically consists of the Cluster, which will pop 1 card, a Cyber Dragon Infinity, and a Tristaros, which will synchro into either Skeletus, follow-up, Dragster for a small trap negate, or the level 9, which the name evades me, is that one Coriandrax, that banishes 3 monsters from your opponent's field or graveyard. The Crystron cards can't really access the Canine cards, so sometimes you are just playing pure Crystron and have to be okay with that. And while the deck's not terrible, that does just feel like a step below just other decks you could be playing. The Canine cards, however, can bridge into Crystron by using the Infinitrack River Storm, I want to say, it's the rank 5, that adds an Earth Machine. It can add Scrap Recycler, which sends from deck to graveyard a machine, and then puts you into your Crystron cards, and there you go. My problems with this deck lie in the fact that I just don't think the Crystron cards are good enough. I think part of the reason I like the Vanquish Soul deck is being able to play Holisu is broken. And before, what I didn't like about Holisu is it was the sacking Holisu. But now with other cards that replicate the sort of effect it has, it stops becoming so high roll and volatile, and it can become an actual game plan. Crystron is not the same in that regard. I just think its power level is a little too weak to be at the top. It's not because it's weak to any one hand trap or weak to any one situation. Oh, ironically, it does lose to Lancia, though. The Canine cards help with that, but yeah. Next up in the decent section is Momento. So Momento can push through hand traps very well. And even though the Canine cards are good against Momento, I don't expect anyone rank 5 to really be a death sentence for, for Momento. Because you can make enough countermeasures and play it in enough different ways so that one rank 5, whether it be a negate of Ripper or a suck up or a book, won't be detrimental, right? Books don't matter that much because you can fuse away whatever's set. Stealing a card doesn't matter when you can send through it, and one negate doesn't matter when your deck already plays well into negation. Truthfully, Momento is a crazy deck because when it goes first, almost nothing can stop it. That really hasn't changed. One thing I've actually found to be funny is when I'm playing against this deck as a Dracotail player, sometimes you can outgrind it. And the big thing I'm looking for there is if you play Crow, you can Crow the Combined Creation, add back the Crow, and then hit the Akihiron. And after you hit both, then you can start winning the grind game against them, because otherwise it's hard. So yeah, I think Momento is still a decent choice. Maybe I'm speaking of this deck too highly, but I love how it's not weak to Charmies or Droll, really, which, while they matter less now, still exist. And that brings me to 3 sort of decks. Mitsurugi and its variants, Risle and its variants like Automatopoeias, and Malice. Decks that would have been the top of the pyramid just a couple weeks ago. I think Mitsurugi has fallen from what I'd consider tier 1. My problem with Mitsurugi is the Canine cards feel pretty good into it, as well as they just don't feel that good into both Dracotail and Vanquish Soul. Dracotail and Vanquish Soul don't care about the field as much, as well as Vanquish Soul has destruction and protection. All of that kind of means that Mitsurugi is a little awkward in some positions. As well as what's interesting is Mysterion the Crown Dragon can randomly just banish entire fields of Mitsurugi decks. That being said, Mitsurugi cards aren't terrible. For example, I think Mitsurugi plays well into Yummy. The end boards are not unplayable. They can still for sure win against either of the other 2 decks I mentioned. And going second, it plays rather decently into the decks as well. For example, it's not a death sentence in a second against Dracotail. Obviously, it depends on what version of Mitsurugi you play, because you could have Risle cards or Fainsmith cards or Orcust cards to help supplement this problem, but then it detracts from your non-engine, which can matter in other regards. And lastly, the deck that I think just falls in the decent category alongside Mitsu is Automat Risle. So Risle for me is similar. Risle Detonator felt broken because hitting cards on the field was everything months ago. Removal means less now because the best decks have adapted to need or care about it less. And Detonator, for example, just doesn't do that much against Draco Tail. What this means is even when you set up your Detonator, it's not like you can just rely on that to win. If you get Charm Beat and go Detonator pass, I don't feel comfortable with that against a lot of decks. So that factored with consistency issues, it leaves me feeling this deck has just taken a step down. That being said, Cross Detonators still are good cards, as well as it is consistent as all hell, and less droll means you're not getting drolled as much, and that was the biggest problem with the deck before. It all means the deck is still functional. It is a decent deck. You definitely will have some success with it. It can top. But I do not think that Risle variants are going anywhere but down from here around. They're going to slowly trickle and fade away from the format, even if no future hits happen to them. But yeah, that means the sleeper tier 1 deck I have is Malice. I don't know how much of a surprise this is, but there's a couple big reasons. It's similar to Momento in the way that when he goes first, it feels almost unstoppable. And if people are cutting down on hand traps, Malice can thrive in that way. Because while it wasn't weak to hand traps, it could lose if they had an abundance of them and the right copies. Now it's way more likely your one Dormouse just does everything. Malice isn't also particularly weak to board breakers because it plays very well from the hand, the same way the other decks do, with March Hare being so flexible to manage cards like Cryptor and Whitebinder. As well as the traps can dodge the monsters being destroyed. So you have enough flexibility in how you build your board and playing around breakers that you're really safe in multiple ways with Malice. Now, why Malice doesn't go higher on this list is, for one, I think people will give it less attention during the deck build, which can also help Malice. At the same time, it is somewhat warranted. For one, Draco Tail can be hard. Removal is a problem for Malice. Where Malice doesn't care about Izuna as removal, because outside of March Hare, you oftentimes don't need to use a monster effect, you cannot stop 5-mana bouncing your what's it called? Your Dormouse or a Holisu. So there are some games you will just get wrecked. Furthermore, Lancia is still probably going to be people's side decks. It may start being phased out at some point, but I still think Lancia will be there. And Draco Tail specifically can add back that Lancia with Arthalion. It's pretty hard to deal with. So I think that overall just makes this deck a little bit sketchier than I'd like into some of the top matchups. But going first, it's still brilliant, and it can fit in an abundance amount of hand traps and non-engine to cope when it goes second. I think that this deck is a little bit slept on in terms of its ability to keep up. I don't think it has fallen off too far from where the other 3 decks are. So Malice, I could very easily still see walking away with a YCS win. And I'm not be surprised if it has several tops either. And okay, that is my breakdown of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Metagame ecosystem. I hope it gave you guys a good picture of where I see the game right now, and many different factors and interactions that are going to be really important in the metagame and how they affect deck building and what decks can do well. Let me know if you disagree with any of my choices for the rankings, as well as reasonings. If I missed anything important or any decks that are missing. I know last time I did forget Blue Eyes. I'm sorry, I just straight up forgot. But it is literally impossible for me to remember every deck for some reason. There was always one deck missing, so let me know. What did I miss this time? But if I missed something relevant, then yell at me, let me know. I'm all for it. I'm ready for it. And I'll see you guys all next time. Have a good one.